Let me take us back to a moment that might have slipped under the radar, but really shouldn't have. Not long ago, Donald Trump posted something that, at first glance, looked like just another political jab on social media. It was a photo of a man's hand marked with a few strange symbols and the bold letters MS-13 stamped right above them. Underneath it, Trump wrote a statement accusing Democrats of trying to bring this person, whom he claims is a violent gang member, back to the United States. He said this was a man with MS-13 tattoos, a man who beat up his wife, and someone that he, as president, was elected to remove from the country. Now, depending on your background or how long you followed immigration policy, that post may have triggered some strong reactions. Fear, anger, confusion, maybe even agreement. But here's where the story takes a turn. Because when you look closer at that image, when you peel back the digital noise and the political framing, what you actually find isn't proof. It's misdirection. The letters MS-13 weren't tattoos at all. They were digitally added to the image. How do we know? Well, we've got the original photo posted by the El Salvadorian government in where the man's hand is completely bare of any gang markings. And here's the real kicker. Two highly respected courts reviewed this exact case and found zero credible evidence that the man Trump labeled as MS-13 had any affiliation with the gang at all. So it raises a very simple but very serious question. If this image and this story are so clear-cut, why did two courts say the opposite? That's the moment when the narrative begins to unravel. And what we're going to do together in this video is walk through the pieces. We'll look at what's being claimed, what's really happening, and why it matters not just for the person in that photo, but for every American who still believes in facts, fairness, and the rule of law. Let's start with the story behind the label, how MS-13 became more than a gang and turned into a political weapon. Here's something I want you to sit with for just a moment. Why MS-13? Why does that particular gang keep popping up in speeches, tweets, and campaign ads, especially around election season? It's not just coincidence, it's part of a much deeper pattern. Let's rewind to the 2018 midterms, a year when Republicans were fighting hard to maintain control of Congress. If you turned on the TV back then, you probably remember the flood of political ads. Many of them didn't focus on policy or economic plans. Instead, they leaned into one message. Immigrants are dangerous. MS-13 is coming for your community. There was one ad in particular, released by Trump's campaign, that featured images of brutal gang members, heavily tattooed, shouting threats, and tied them directly to Democrats' immigration policies. It was quickly condemned as racist and misleading, and networks like CNN even refused to air it. But it didn't matter. The goal wasn't accuracy. The goal was emotion, specifically fear. And fear, when used strategically, becomes one of the most powerful political weapons out there. It bypasses logic. It overrides facts. It taps straight into our survival instincts. Now, let me be clear here. I'm not downplaying the violence MS-13 is responsible for. They're a real gang with a record of horrifying crimes. But here's where the distortion happens. Statistically, MS-13 represents a tiny fraction of gang activity in the U.S. According to FBI data, they make up less than 1% of all gang members nationwide. And yet, if you only followed political narratives, you'd think they were everywhere. Because they're visually shocking, easy to vilify, and perhaps most conveniently, they're foreign-born. It creates a narrative that says, this isn't just about crime, it's about outsiders bringing crime to us. As someone who's lived through multiple election cycles, I've seen how this kind of messaging works. It doesn't invite us to think, it invites us to react. And that's dangerous because fear, once weaponized, is hard to dial back. And this isn't just a theory. We've seen this playbook before. Whether it was Willie Horton in the 80s or Caravans in 2018, the formula is the same. Find an extreme example, amplify it, apply it to an entire group, then offer yourself as the only one who can stop it. I know many of you watching this have seen these tactics firsthand, maybe even in your own communities, where immigrant families live, work, and contribute every single day. And they're nothing like the caricatures we see in those campaign videos. So when Trump posts an image like that and attaches it to a whole immigration debate, it's not just misleading, it's intentional, it's strategic, it's textbook fear politics. And sadly, it works. But to understand why that tactic still works today, we need to unpack the specific symbols Trump used and why twisting their meaning wasn't just dishonest, but actually dangerous. Let's talk about those symbols next. Now here's where things go from misleading to almost surreal. Imagine looking down at your t-shirt and realizing that, according to a former US president, it could be mistaken for a gang tattoo. That's essentially what happened when Donald Trump posted that image, the one with the man's hand and the cryptic symbols above it. Right there, above a small collection of tattoos, a skull, a cross, a smiley face, and a cannabis leaf, Trump had digitally added the letters MS-13 and claimed this man was part of a violent gang. Let's pause here. I don't know about you, but I've seen that skull design on shirts from Target. I've seen people wear smiley face hoodies in coffee shops. The cannabis leaf? That's printed on socks in every corner store now, especially with marijuana being legal in over half the states. So to say those are gang symbols, that's not just wrong. That's reckless. Because real gang symbols, especially for groups like MS-13, are not subtle. They're bold, aggressive, and meant to send a message. Members often tattoo MS or MS-13 in giant block letters across their forearms, necks, faces, even their eyelids. This isn't hidden iconography. It's loud, it's direct, and it's meant to intimidate. And don't just take my word for it. Oscar Martinez, a journalist who spent over a decade covering MS-13 in Central America, said plain and simple that none of the hundreds of sources he interviewed ever mentioned these types of symbols being associated with the gang. That alone should have shut this narrative down. But here's what's more troubling. When public figures start labeling normal, everyday imagery, like a cross or a smiley, as criminal symbols, they're not just smearing individuals. They're setting a precedent. It opens the door for law enforcement and immigration authorities to judge people not by their actions or affiliations, but by what's inked on their skin, or worse, what they're wearing. And let's be honest, that door rarely opens equally for everyone. It hits communities of color, immigrants, poor folks who already face systemic bias. This part really hit home for me. I grew up in a neighborhood where tattoos weren't just art, they were stories. Stories of family, of survival, of faith. If someone had a cross on their hand, it usually meant they lost someone. It didn't mean they were in a gang. So to see those symbols twisted, politicized, and broadcast to millions, it's not just dishonest, it's deeply unfair. And here's the truth. If a cannabis leaf is enough to brand someone a criminal, what happens to the millions of Americans who legally use medical marijuana? Do we start criminalizing them too? At what point do we stop and ask, who benefits from this kind of narrative? We're not just talking about tattoos anymore. We're talking about identity, about dignity, about how far some will go to push an agenda, even if it means targeting the innocent. And that's what leads us to the next piece of this story, how Trump twisted a Supreme Court defeat into a victory lap, and why that lie might be the most dangerous one yet. Here's something that still blows my mind, because it goes beyond spin, beyond political games. It's a case where reality was so clear, so undeniable, that even the Supreme Court, yes, this Supreme Court, ruled against Donald Trump unanimously. 9-0, no dissents, no room for doubt. And yet, Trump got up and told the American people he won. Now, if that made you do a double take, you're not alone. Let's walk through what actually happened. The case involved a man named Garcia, who had been deported without due process. The issue wasn't just about his immigration status. It was about whether or not the government had the legal authority to remove someone without following the process guaranteed under U.S. law. The Supreme Court looked at the facts, listened to both sides, and came to a crystal clear conclusion. What the Trump administration did was illegal. It wasn't close. It wasn't controversial. It was 9-0, but that didn't stop Trump. In a speech shortly after, he told his audience that we won that case 9-0. He even implied that the decision meant El Salvador had to keep Garcia locked up, which is not what the court said at all. And this is where it gets dangerous, because when a former president can stand in front of the country and claim a total legal loss is a win, and people believe it, it starts to erode something far more important than political opinions. It undermines trust in the system itself. We live in a country built on the rule of law. You might not always like the outcome. You might not always agree with the judges. But we've always had at least one shared understanding. The law is the law. And when someone tries to rewrite the law in public memory to literally change the meaning of a court decision, that's not just dishonest. That's authoritarian behavior. Now, I'm not throwing that word around lightly. I know how serious it is. But look, if the Supreme Court no longer has final say and the facts no longer matter, what does? And here's what really sticks with me. This wasn't a slip of the tongue. This was a choice. A deliberate narrative delivered confidently because it plays into a larger strategy. If the courts are against you, claim they're not. If the law says you're wrong, say you're right. If the truth isn't on your side, invent a new one. And the scary part is, for a lot of people it works. But that's not the end of the story, because behind this legal battle is something even more disturbing. A secret deal involving $15 million of taxpayer money that most Americans still haven't heard about. Let's talk about what that money was used for and why you absolutely have a right to be outraged. What would you say if I told you that $15 million of your tax dollars were being used not to fix roads, not to fund schools, not even to help veterans, but to keep one man locked up in a foreign prison against the direct ruling of the U.S. Supreme Court? Yeah, that's not just frustrating, that's outrageous. And yet, according to Senator Chris Van Hollen, that's exactly what the Trump administration did. After the court ruled that Kilmer Garcia had been illegally detained and deported without due process, you'd think the next step would be obvious. Follow the law. Bring him back. Do it right. Instead, what reportedly happened is that the administration struck a deal with the government of El Salvador, a financial arrangement designed to ensure Garcia stayed in prison there, regardless of what the court said, $15 million. To put it bluntly, we're talking about U.S. taxpayer money being used to help another country violate a man's rights. Also, a former president could avoid appearing soft on crime or having to walk back a bad decision. And let's be clear, this isn't some abstract policy disagreement. This is a direct challenge to the ethics and legality of how our government exercises power beyond its borders. Because when you send money, not to improve a diplomacy, but to maintain an illegal detention, you're no longer just stretching the law. You're stepping outside of it. And here's the thing, this kind of deal doesn't just affect one man. It sends a message to the world that the United States is willing to ignore its own legal system when it becomes politically inconvenient. That has real diplomatic consequences. It undermines our credibility in international courts. It weakens human rights negotiations, and it gives authoritarian leaders across the globe the perfect excuse to say, see, even the US does it. Now, personally, this hits me at a gut level, because whether you're liberal or conservative, Democrat or Republican, we all want a country where the rule of law means something, where money doesn't override justice, where decisions made by the highest court in the land actually matter. So when I heard Senator Van Hollen say, I will not vote for one penny of funding that supports this, I felt a bit of relief, not because of politics, but because at least someone was willing to draw a line in the sand. And if you're watching this thinking, okay, this can't get worse, well, buckle up, because in the middle of all this legal and political maneuvering, we've lost sight of the most important piece, the person at the center of it all. Let's take a moment to talk about who Kilmer Garcia actually is and why his story matters more than the headlines ever let on. It's easy to get lost in the headlines, the legal jargon, and the political back and forth. But behind all of this, behind the tweets, the court case, the $15 million, there's a real person, and his name is Kilmer Garcia. Now here's what most of the news won't tell you. Garcia isn't some shadowy figure lurking in the background of gang violence. He's not a drug kingpin. He's not even a criminal. He's a father, a husband, an asylum seeker who fled El Salvador hoping for protection in the United States. Something that, not long ago, we still used to see as a basic American promise. According to court records, Garcia had no violent criminal history. There were no charges, no convictions. The government simply decided he was dangerous, without a trial, without a hearing, and put him on a plane back to a country where his life was at risk. That's where due process comes in. See, due process isn't some abstract legal phrase. It's the guardrail that protects every single one of us, whether you were born here, immigrated here, or just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. It says the government can't just act on suspicion. It has to prove it, in a courtroom, with facts, with fairness. And in Garcia's case, that didn't happen. Instead, the system skipped all the steps we count on to prevent abuse and justified it later with headlines, photo ops, and tweets. The worst part? He's not the only one. There are dozens, if not hundreds of people in similar situations right now, stuck in legal limbo, waiting for hearings that are backlogged for years, or worse, deported without warning. And this isn't just a border issue, it's a systemic flaw in how immigration is handled, one that fails to distinguish between actual threats and people like Garcia, who are simply seeking safety. Now look, I know immigration is a tough topic. I know it brings up strong feelings, personal experiences, deep concerns about safety and fairness. But I believe we're better when we stop seeing people like Garcia as headlines and start seeing them as human beings. Because if it were you, or your son, or your friend, wouldn't you want the country you believed in to follow its own rules? This isn't just about immigration, it's about integrity. And it's about whether we still believe that justice applies to everyone, not just the lucky or the powerful. And that brings us to a much bigger question. What happens when leaders not only ignore due process, but start behaving like they're above the law altogether? Let's talk about that, because this isn't theoretical anymore. This is where authoritarianism stops being a warning sign and starts becoming reality. What if I told you that the erosion of a democracy doesn't always come with a loud crash? Sometimes it begins with a shrug, a slow fade of rules, a silence when there should be outrage, a leader who says they don't deserve due process, and people simply nod. That's when you have to ask, is this what authoritarianism looks like when it's wearing a suit and waving a flag? Authoritarianism isn't just about strong men shouting from balconies. It's about a pattern. First, discredit the media. Then attack the judiciary, undermine experts, spread fear, promote us versus them, and most dangerously, erode the idea that everyone is entitled to the same rights under the law. We've seen this before. Look back at the 1930s, not just in Germany, but in Spain, in Italy, in parts of Latin America. Leaders began with emergency powers. They demonized certain groups. They changed laws in the name of safety. And the public, afraid, tired, uncertain, let it happen. Now, am I saying America is there yet? No, but if we don't recognize the signs, we might not notice how close we're getting. When Trump shared that tweet, attaching symbols to a man's face, calling him part of MS-13 without trial, it wasn't just a political tactic. It was a warning shot. And when his supporters cheered, not caring that two courts had rejected the basis of the claim, it became something deeper. A test of how much we're willing to look the other way. I've had conversations with veterans, retired judges, lifelong public servants. Many of them tell me the same thing. It's not one moment that breaks democracy, it's the moments we ignore. That stays with me because I think of my own parents who taught me to never take rights for granted. They grew up in places where people disappeared for asking questions. So yes, history matters here. We don't need to sensationalize. We just need to pay attention. Because when due process becomes optional for one person, it soon becomes optional for anyone. And that's not just a political issue, that's a moral one. Up next, we'll bring it all home. What does this mean for you? And what can you actually do about it? Stay with me. We're almost there. So let's take a breath and bring it all together. We started with a tweet, a single image that was digitally altered to provoke fear. We saw how a false narrative was amplified, even when the court said otherwise. We explored how MS-13 became a political scapegoat, how innocent symbols were twisted, and how misinformation can shape public opinion in dangerous ways. We looked at how due process, the foundation of justice in America, was bypassed, and how celebrating false victories erodes trust in our institutions. And then we asked the harder question: are we witnessing the early signs of authoritarianism right here at home? Now here's where it gets personal, because this isn't just about Trump. Trump. It's not even just about politics. It's about us, the kind of country we want to live in, the values we're willing to defend, and how easily those values can be chipped away when we're distracted, divided, or simply too tired to care. So what can you do? First, stay curious. When something seems too perfect or too outrageous, take a moment to ask, is this the whole story? Second, know your rights. Due process, freedom of the press, checks and balances. These aren't just textbook concepts. They're real protections that keep all of us safe. Third, don't stay silent. Talk about this with friends, with family, even with people who might disagree, because silence is what misinformation thrives on. And finally, Atrim, if this video resonated with you, help it reach someone who needs to see it. Like this video so more people can find it. Comment with your thoughts. I'd love to hear your perspective. Share it with someone who's been questioning what's going on in the world right now. And if you want to stay informed, subscribe and join our newsletter. I'll be sharing updates, resources, and tools to help you stay engaged and empowered. This isn't the end of the conversation. It's just the beginning. Let's keep learning, questioning, and standing up for the truth together.